All right, let's dive into U.S. history. We're using that entire History of the United States documentary from YouTube. We're going to see how this country, went from just colonies to like a global power, right?
Yeah, it's quite a ride. We're going to hit those key moments, the ones that really made the U.S. what it is today.
So right off the bat, the doc jumps into these early colonial conflicts, huh? Like the French and the English, they're battling it out over fur trade and land, and Native Americans are often caught right in the middle of it all.
And what's interesting is Native Americans, they weren't just sitting back passively. They used their knowledge of the land, their alliances, played the Europeans against each other, tried to hold on to their own power and influence.
Yeah, the doc talks about King Philip's War. Really brutal example of that culture clash. I mean, the death toll for the population at the time, it was the highest in U.S. history.
King Philip's War, it wasn't just about land, right?
Yeah.
Resources, different ways of life. Ultimately, it was about survival.
Yeah.
And unfortunately, it kind of set this pattern of violence and displacement that keeps popping up in U.S. history.
And it's not just King Philip's War, is it? The doc mentions like 4 major wars between France and England, 17th and 18th centuries. Crazy how stuff happening across the ocean in Europe would trigger wars fought here in the colonies.
Right. Imagine what that did to Native American and colonial communities. I mean, the toll it took. Lives lost, homes destroyed, and it just brewed all this resentment, right? Each war kind of deepened those tensions, just
Yeah.
setting the stage for more conflict.
Okay, so then there's this thing the doc calls Protestant impact during those wars. Huge religious revival, the Great Awakening, like preachers like George Whitefield drawing crowds bigger than all of Boston.
But the Great Awakening, it wasn't just about religion, was it? Challenging authority, individual conscience, personal experience. It got people questioning traditional power,
Right.
even the power of the British crown.
So when Britain starts tightening its grip after the French and Indian War, taxes like the Stamp Act and Townsend Acts, well, that resentment turns into serious resistance.
Exactly. The colonists, they were used to a degree of self-governance, right? They saw these taxes as like an attack on their freedom. The Boston Tea Party, that was a big, loud NO to British control.
And of course, that defiance just makes things worse. The British hit back with the intolerable acts, trying to clamp down even harder, just pushes the colonies closer and closer to revolution.
It's all connected, isn't it? Resources, culture clashes, religious fervor, economic tensions, all these things build up, right? Like a powder keg ready to explode.
And explode it does. The American Revolution, it wasn't just some spur-of-the-moment thing, was it? Decades of simmering discontent, and finally, it boils over. First shots at Lexington and Concord. Those were the shots heard around the world, the start of a new nation.
And the Declaration of Independence, that's really powerful, bold statement, right? The colonies, they're independent states now. Self-governance, it's about ideas, liberty, equality, deciding your own fate. Those ideas, they inspired revolutions all over the world.
Winning independence, though, that's just step one. The doc talks about the challenges the Continental Army faced, going up against the biggest military power in the world. Shortages, internal divisions.
And yet, despite that, they still pull off key victories. Trenton, Princeton. Those kept the spirit of the revolution going. And of course, you had figures like George Washington leading the charge.
Can't forget foreign powers either, right? France, especially, they were crucial in backing the American cause. Money, military support, helped turn the tide of the war.
Saratoga, that was a turning point. Decisive win for the Americans. That's what convinced France to officially side with the U.S. alliances, international support. It can really shape how things turn out.
So they win the war, independence is declared, and then what? The Articles of Confederation, that was a first try at governing, and the doc explains how it kind of flopped.
Well, the Articles were designed to be weak on purpose, weren't they?
Okay.
More power to individual states. That's because the colonists were so wary of a strong central government after Britain, right?
But it sounds like that backfired. Shays' Rebellion, the doc uses that as an example. A weak, decentralized system, struggling to keep things in order.
Shays' Rebellion was a wake-up call. Showed everyone that under the Articles, the government, it was just too weak, couldn't raise taxes for an army, couldn't control trade between states, couldn't even enforce its own laws.
So that leads to a brand new document, right? The U.S. Constitution. The idea was balance, keep some autonomy for the states. BUT, give the federal government enough power to deal with national issues.
And it's amazing how those debates from back then, Federalists wanting a stronger national government, anti-Federalists wanting states' rights, they're still relevant, aren't they? It's still about that balance of power, the role of government.
The Constitution, it was a framework, but the story, it keeps going. The dock moves on to westward expansion and this idea of manifest destiny, the Louisiana Purchase, Lewis and Clark. That's the spirit of exploration, pushing boundaries, but it's complicated, isn't it?
Manifest destiny. It was this belief that the U.S. was meant to expand across the entire continent, Atlantic to Pacific. Like, it was their God-given right, a mission. But that expansion, it came at a huge cost, especially for Native Americans.
The doc doesn't sugarcoat it. Indian Removal Act, the Trail of Tears, brutal reminders of what happened to Native Americans in the name of westward expansion.
Two sides to the coin, right? Adventure, discovery, opportunity,
Yeah.
but also forced relocation, communities torn apart. It's a complex legacy. We have to acknowledge both sides.
And it wasn't just Native Americans affected by westward expansion. It also poured fuel on the whole slavery debate.
Wow.
Ultimately, setting the stage for the Civil War, one of the biggest turning points in U.S. history.
Like the Mexican-American War, right? U.S. gets all this land, but then it's like, okay, what about slavery? Can it spread to these new territories? That question just wouldn't go away.
And it explodes, right? The Civil War. Brutal. Absolutely brutal. The country tearing itself apart.
It's easy to say, oh, it was just about slavery. But it was more than that, wasn't it? States' rights, economic differences between North and South, cultural divides, I mean, they ran deep. The attack on Fort Sumter, the doc shows that, and you really see how all that tension just erupts.
The doc focuses on some big names, right? Lincoln, obviously, trying to keep the Union together. And then you've got Grant, Lee, leading armies. I mean, through some truly horrific battles.
Gettysburg, Vicksburg.
Yeah.
Those weren't just battles, they were turning points. They decided how the whole war would go and really the fate of the nation. And then Lincoln issues the Emancipation Proclamation right in the middle of it all. Changes everything.
Yeah, that one document, it reframed the whole fight. It wasn't just about preserving the Union anymore. It was about ending slavery. But winning the war, that didn't magically solve the problem of racial inequality, did it? The doc makes that clear.
Reconstruction, that's what they called it, the time after the war. Rebuilding the South. Trying to integrate formerly enslaved people. But it was a mess. Politics, social upheaval, people resisting change at every turn. Equality on paper, that's one thing, but actually living it, that's a whole other story, isn't it?
Sure.
Takes a lot longer, much more complicated.
And then, boom, we're into the late 1800s, early 1900s. Fast forward, right? Industrialization, cities growing like crazy. Gilded Age, they call it. But from what I'm hearing, maybe not so golden for everyone.
Incredible innovation, economic growth, that's true. But who's getting all that wealth? It's concentrated, right? Rockefeller, Carnegie, these guys are building huge fortunes, and the doc doesn't shy away from how they did it, some pretty ruthless business practices.
Rockefeller, oil, Carnegie, steel, they created monopolies, controlled entire industries.
And of course, that means inequality. The doc shows the workers the conditions they faced, long hours, dangerous work, barely any pay. And this is where you start to see labor unions forming, workers organizing, fighting for their rights.
The Transcontinental Railroad, what a feat of engineering, right? Connected the coasts, opened up the West. But even with that progress, there's a dark side. The doc shows that too.
Cities exploding in size, and with that comes a whole bunch of new problems. Poverty, crime, terrible housing conditions. It was a crazy time, huge changes, good and bad, all mixed together.
Then bam, the 20th century. 2 world wars, the Roaring Twenties, the Great Depression, the Cold War. It's like, where do we even begin with all that?
It changes everything. The world, America's place in it. Everything's different now. World War I, the U.S. is on the global stage in a whole new way. And then you've got the Roaring Twenties, all that economic boom, cultural shifts, and then it all comes crashing down with the Great Depression.
Hard to grasp how bad the Depression really was. Millions unemployed, families struggling to survive. The doc shows the human cost, the despair. It really hit everyone hard.
It was a test, wasn't it, for American society, for the whole system. And that's when you see the role of government change big time. FDR, his New Deal programs, relief, recovery, reform. The federal government steps in like never before.
But just as the country's getting back on its feet, World War II starts. Pearl Harbor, D-Day, the atomic bombs. The doc doesn't hold back on the big moments.
This is a world war, reshaping the entire global landscape. The U.S. comes out of it a superpower, but a new kind of tension is brewing. The Soviet Union, the Cold War, it's a whole new era.
Yeah, the Cold War, it was a different kind of fight. Not armies clashing on the battlefield, but this ideological battle, politics, threat of nuclear war hanging over everything. The doc does a good job showing how much anxiety people had back then, all that uncertainty.
It was everywhere, the Cold War. Influenced foreign policy, domestic politics, even pop culture. Korea, Vietnam, The Cuban Missile Crisis, the space race, everything's happening in the shadow of this U.S.-Soviet rivalry. And in the middle of all that, another fight is going on right here in America, the civil rights movement.
And the doc really highlights the people who fought for racial equality, their courage, their determination. Martin Luther King Jr. leading marches, protests, demanding an end to segregation, discrimination. It was a long fight.
A pivotal moment in U.S. history, no doubt. Challenged centuries of injustice, led to major legal changes, social changes. But the doc makes it clear, the fight isn't over, is it? Equality, it's a process, an ongoing thing.
No easy answers. And the doc keeps going, doesn't it? Late 20th century, early 21st century, technology changes everything, globalization, the world's getting more and more connected, and it seems like the upheaval never really stops. Vietnam War, man, that really divided the country, left scars that, we're still dealing with, and then boom, the internet, personal computers, talk about changing the game. Communication, business, our everyday lives, it all happened so fast.
Yeah, and the doc doesn't pretend it was all sunshine and roses, right?
Yeah.
Economic ups and downs, the dot-com bubble bursting, the global economy. Everything's so interconnected now. It's a whole new world, for better or worse.
And then, well, events that I think are still really painful for a lot of us, 9/11, the war on terror, it's like a reminder that things can change in an instant. And how those events, they've shaped so much our foreign policy, how we think about security, it's still with us.
It's not just what's happening out there either. The doc covers the Great Recession, Obama being elected the first black president, social media, how it's changed politics, the pandemic, and man, the political division in this country. It's a lot.
It is a lot. Feels like the world's spinning faster and faster. Looking back at all of U.S. history, though, I mean, it's incredible, right? From those little colonies to a global superpower, it's been wild. Triumphs, tragedies, progress, setbacks, the whole package.
The thing that strikes me is how many of these themes just keep coming back, the fight for equality, balancing individual freedom with what we owe to each other, trying to govern a country this big, this diverse. Those are still the big questions even today. History, it's not just dates and names, it's who we are, right? Helps us make sense of where we are in NWA.
That's what makes it so interesting. It's not just trivia, it's about those forces that shaped the country, the world, U.S. even. Out of everything we've talked about, is there a moment or a theme that really stands out to you? Something that really changed the course of the U.S.?
For me, it's that push and pull between the ideal, equality, liberty, and then the reality. Inequality, oppression. It's there from the start, pushing Native Americans off their land, slavery, the civil rights movement, fighting for economic justice. That tension, that struggle, it runs through all of American history. It's like a reminder that progress isn't always a straight line, is it? And the fight for a more just world, it never really ends.
Yeah, I get that. Makes you think about what we can do, right? As individuals, as a country. How do we learn from all this to build a better future? Lots to think about after this deep dive.
That's the thing about history. It's not about memorizing facts. It's about thinking critically, asking questions, looking at things from different angles. What surprised the eye in all this? What connections did you make? What are you going to go learn more about now?
Right. We've only just scratched the surface. This is just the beginning. Thanks for joining us on this wild ride through U.S. history. Keep learning, keep asking those tough questions, and keep using the past to understand the present and to build that better future. See you next time.